I think we can go ahead and get started. I'll start us off. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Today's session is entitled Breaking the Stigma, Mental Health Advocacy in Prisons and Jails. Today we have with us Sheba Williams, who is the director of NoLef Turns. This is an advocacy group that also does a lot of work with people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, and a lot of work with that population. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping rules that we just want to go over. So speakers, please remember, or Sheba, please remember that we're using live captioning and interpreting services. So when you introduce yourself today, which I have failed to do already, as a speaker or participant, just include a physical description of yourself and your preferred pronouns. My name is Nicole Durrose, and I forgot to even tell you all who I am. I am an advocate with Disability Law Center, Virginia. My pronouns are she and her. I am a white woman with short curly hair, and I'm wearing a black shirt with a yellow cardigan. And this is just going to help provide context for any attendees who may be blind or vision impaired. It'll also help our interpreters and captioners locate who is speaking on the screen. Lastly, we ask that you stay muted at all times unless you are the speaker, and that you hold all questions until the end, unless Sheba would like you guys to jump in. She will let us know that. We do have a chat box that will be monitored. I'll be monitoring the chat box for any questions or comments that you guys want to make. Questions only in the chat box. At the end of the session, I will ask some of the questions from there. If your question is chosen, you can take yourself off of mute and you can ask your question, or type your question in the box. So I will let Sheba take it away and introduce herself and talk a little bit more about NoLef Turns.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Sheba Williams. I am the founder and executive director of a Richmond, Virginia-based nonprofit called NoLef Turns. We work with individuals who have felony convictions in the state, which includes individuals who are leaving long-term incarceration or have been convicted. I am a Black woman with long Black braids today and glasses. I am wearing a white shirt with red trim, and my pronouns are she, her. What else am I doing? My intro. Thank you.
Well, I think today what we were going to do is just ask some, I was going to ask Sheba some questions just about around mental health in prisons, and, get her feedback on what she's seen, and, any advice or comments that she wants to make. I think we can make this a very much more dialogue driven session. So, if anybody has a question, and we do have like a bit of a small group here, that I think it's perfectly fine. If you have a question, just jump in, put it in the chat. We are going to be laid back about this, and learn more about mental health in prisons. So our first question today is, you talked a little bit about what your nonprofit does. Can you talk a little more about maybe the different services that you offer or different programs? What makes it different from other jail or prison advocacy groups, if anything?
Yes, we have a few programs. We have a pretrial support program, which works with individuals who have not yet been convicted, but have been arrested and charged with crimes. We have an aftercare program for people who are who have been released from Department of Corrections longer than 12 months. Our biggest program is our reentry program, which works with individuals who have been released from Department of Corrections or Bureau of Prisons in the past 12 months. We have a pre-release program where we work with people who have less than 4 years, but it has been very difficult since COVID started to implement that program because of the COVID numbers are now going back up. We do have a harm reduction program where we work with individuals with substance use disorder, and we also do a lot of COVID supplies and distribution. We do naloxone training, and we also have an advocacy training program that pulls into our advocacy work in the General Assembly, which impacts some policies around individuals who have criminal contact or contact with the carceral systems. And we do have some specialty things, like our organization was successful in getting the first ever expungement bill passed for people with convictions. That does not take effect until 2025. So we do some info sessions on expungement or record sealing, and we do some pardon support and also a lot of direct services for individuals who have had justice and court involvement.
That's pretty impressive. The expungement thing, right, alone is amazing.
A lot of work.
Yeah, and we need that work. How do people receive services from your group?
We have an online intake application, and for individuals who are incarcerated, they can reach out and we can mail them an application. But our intake application is at www.nolefturns.org/client resources, and I'll drop it in the chat. But mostly people will apply online. They will schedule a one-on-one intake appointment, and we will go over like goals and things that they need. We start the program and support individuals who are leaving long-term incarceration. It really depends on what their specific needs are. I did not answer what makes our program unique. We had a 0% recidivism rate for our first 5 years. When we started doing pretrial support, we did have some lapses, so we're still at a less than 3% rate. And most of our board and staff are directly impacted by incarceration. I myself was wrongfully convicted of a crime in 2004, so we have like intimate knowledge of the systems that we are working to change.
Well, that sounds awesome. Definitely having representation on the board and with you, like, that's always what needed, is people who have that lived experience and know what it's like. And not to pivot a little bit, but we're gonna switch. You mentioned COVID earlier and how that impacted your services. And going back to mental health, how did COVID have an impact on mental health trends in prisons? What did your agency see?
So COVID was interesting. The first thing is, as a statewide volunteer, all of our staff were able to go inside of Department of Corrections up until about the end of 2019, early 2020. That changed contact with the outside world for individuals who are incarcerated. That also meant that visitation came to a grinding halt. So people were alone. We know that there is a large population of individuals in jails and prisons who suffer from behavioral health issues, but COVID really increased the number of issues that we saw with individuals that we serve. We saw that people couldn't do video visits with their families. They couldn't get contact visits. A lot of them were in their cells for a long period of time. When there was a COVID outbreak, they were packed into gyms a lot of times, or congregate areas where you really could not escape the fear of contracting this disease that nobody knew who would die from. You had individuals who were sentenced to come home at some point who were facing death. So there was a lot of anxiety. There still is a lot of anxiety. We still hear from a lot of people who had issues. The separation, the isolation, the treatment of individuals who are incarcerated, because there was a lot of stigma around whether or not these people deserve dignity, whether or not they receive the health resources. And aside from COVID, if there were individuals with behavioral health issues who should have had counseling, who should have had access to services, that was largely taken away. Of course, medications were still distributed, but it was hit or miss at a lot of facilities from what we were told. Like talking to people, some people did not even see a nurse for months. So the impact is large. And now that we're seeing an increase in the COVID numbers, there's a fear that isolation will hit again. We know that there's an issue with solitary confinement and the impact on a person's mental health. COVID was essentially the same thing, right? human contact is necessary for all of us. But inside of a facility where your movements are restricted and you can only use the phones or use the kiosk, which is the messaging system, or have video visits, a lot of times you miss a lot of that contact. So we went to an event at the Richmond Justice Center last Friday, I believe it was, and the sheriff said that about 90% of the population had some sort of behavioral health issue. So that is a huge increase from pre-COVID numbers. Just a, hard thing to digest, because not just people inside, but people also outside, are seeing huge impacts on mental health based on COVID alone. So we got
And
work to
with
do.
that, and that also leads me to a question I was thinking was, with that increase, I think we can all guess the answer to this, but, did Department of Corrections, do anything different to address that? Did they, try to provide additional mental health services, or, getting people access to services at some point?
For practical purposes, they said that they were, but reality is no. Just blatantly saying, no. We have a lot of people who come home and are struggling to readjust already. And if there is an compounded with a behavioral health issue, sometimes just making the switch between being released or being inside where a person's Medicaid continues, where they can get access to their medications or get access to different providers. That was a big thing that we saw being dropped, the ball being dropped on a lot. People weren't getting that continuity of care because there was little regard for the people who were housed in Department of Corrections. We hear a lot. We hear a lot about trying to do better. I was actually on a task force with the Lieutenant Governor at the time, Justin Fairfax, to address individuals in Department of Corrections and congregate homes, like transitional housing and different things like that, and how the behavioral health affected those people and how to get better help. But little has been done to address those issues and those increases in numbers of people who need services.
And is that because one of the questions that we have is what problems are you seeing for formerly incarcerated people reentering the community, and particularly, of course, in regards to mental health? Are those services being connections being made for warm handoffs upon discharge, or what does that look like?
So it's hit or miss. Some people have a counselor that will take the necessary steps to make sure that a person can get that continuity of care once they're released. It really depends on that facility, that counselor, when a person is released, if they have probation or parole or what have you, if they have somebody who will walk through the steps. But it is very difficult to engage with Department of Corrections sometimes and get that person to where they need to be within that first 72 hours a week. And not just talking about behavioral health, but talking about substance use disorder. Going to a transitional facility, even if that is a recovery house or a sober living house, sometimes depends on whether or not that person has their Medicaid when they leave, like day one of leaving. Housing is what is, unabridged, the foundation of being able to have stability. Sometimes it depends on whether or not that person has Medicaid, whether or not their home plan allows them to be in a transitional house, or if they have to kind of struggle with figuring it out and then figure out how to get access to a provider who is for them. You don't have, even though telehealth was a thing that I believe was introduced near the end of COVID, you don't have access to that same counselor. If you had a counselor while you were in Department of Corrections, you are kind of starting over once you're released. We have agencies that do great work with behavioral health, but you really have to wait until a person has physically been released from Department of Corrections to start the process over. And sometimes that becomes a problem in itself, because behavioral health, a lot of times, there are a lot of people who have not been diagnosed. There are a lot of people who will not admit that they have a diagnosis. And you still have to rely on those people to take the steps to receive help, say I need help, go get help, and try to get my medical records from the Department of Corrections, try to get my medication list from Department of Corrections, try to switch it over to another doctor. There are so many barriers that come in place with a person's release. And if a person is not vigilant about getting in touch with places like Richmond Behavioral Health Authority or different entities, counselors and things like that, it a lot of times people fall by the wayside.
And I know sometimes people are discharged from prisons and kind of like a step down to DBHDS facilities, like they'll go to Central State Hospital, I think is mostly where they go, to the Max Forensic Unit there, before they reenter society. What are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious. And how do they, I have two questions. So how do they decide who goes through that step down process? And then what are your thoughts on that whole process?
So the bottom line is we don't have enough beds in any facility. Even like young people will go to Western State and Stanton or different things like that. We don't have enough beds to fulfill the needs of individuals who have behavioral health issues. Depending on a person's diagnosis, depending on severity of their issues and what they need in the moment, not in the moment, but in the time that they are in Department of Corrections, determines who goes to these facilities. It has to be prioritized by severity of the issue, but not enough people have access. There's just not enough beds, not enough providers, not enough space, not enough people admitting that there's an issue that needs to be addressed. So, we still have the stigma of that. And unfortunately, it doesn't solve the problem that really needs to be solved. And it impacts the overall community when people don't have access to more readily available services.
Okay. And going back, you mentioned solitary confinement earlier. What are the impacts of solitary confinement on people with mental health diagnosis? And also, if you could talk a little bit about, because I think you're involved with the ending solitary confinement group. If you could talk maybe about that as well.
So, if I think the closest that people can come to relating to what solitary confinement is being in your home during COVID. We heard a lot of people say this is like prison, but being isolated from the world. In solitary confinements, a lot of time you have 23 hours when you're in a cell. 1 hour out for rec, sometimes a few times a week. It should be every couple of days. You should have at least an hour of rec time, but that means that you shower, use the phone, eat, do whatever you need to do in hours time. A lot of times when COVID really happened, a lot of people weren't being removed from their cells for days on end. That in itself would impact anybody's mental health. So, I have friends who are kind of fighting with Department of Corrections now. A really good friend of mine, his son actually, Tuesday was the 1 year anniversary of the death of his son. His son committed suicide while in solitary confinement in Department of Corrections. He complained that he was having a mental health breakdown. He told guards repeatedly that he was hearing voices, he was having hallucinations, and they did nothing. And he ultimately, committed suicide. There are so many individuals who are overlooked if there is not an official diagnosis, but solitary confinement has always been what I consider cruel and unusual punishment because people need people. That human contact impacts the mind, it impacts the brain all the time. That is why we have kangaroo care for babies when they're born. They need to touch other human beings. Solitary confinement it was by design made to keep the safety of the facilities, and Department of Corrections has changed the name so many times to make it a cute name. It went from segregation to solitary confinement to segregation to add seg, and now it's called restorative housing. There's nothing restorative about taking a person away from the overall population. There are ways to keep the facility safe without putting people in total isolation. the push to ban the box, to end solitary confinement has been a long fight that's been led by Natasha White, David Smith, the Solitary Confinement Coalition. A lot of times, and this is nationwide. This is not just in our state. This is something that we knew was causing behavioral issues for people. And in a more personal light, my ex-husband was incarcerated at the age of 15. He was tried as an adult and he was sentenced to 74 years. Because he was the youngest in the state at the time at Southampton Correctional Center, he was placed in solitary confinement as soon as he was put into the facility. He didn't do anything wrong. He was young. He was a child at the time. So to so-called keep him safe, they put him in solitary confinement for 10 months, I think was the first time. And that has had long-term impact on his mental health. At the age of 45 now, and coming from age 15, he clearly has behavioral health issues. It was undiagnosed, but living with him for the past 10 years, it became very obvious that that was the trigger and that was the reason. The isolation is something that really impacts people's ability to thrive once they're released. And it has always been something that we have strongly kind of fought against. And we understand. We understand that safety is the goal, but there are other options, right? So, you know, Department of Corrections has some work to do. There is a big push to eliminate solitary confinement in federal prisons. So we've been seeing like some good things coming out of the federal system, but state facilities and jail facilities honestly have a lot more work to do to get this done.
Mhm. And in prisons, what kind of services are available for people with mental health diagnoses?
There are a few options. There are counselors available. They obviously have access to medication, but there are a lot more people who are not diagnosed than there are diagnosed. There's a stigma attached to a diagnosis. There are issues when people have not been diagnosed before they get to incarceration because they don't get the ability to have the resources they need if there was not a previous diagnosis, right? A lot of people believe that, I believe, and I firmly believe because I deal with these individuals day in and day out, that every person who goes to the Department of Corrections needs some sort of counseling upon their release or prior to their release, just to get their mindset acclimated back to coming to society. It's not just physically dealing with the 46,000 some collateral consequences that come after the sentence, after the conviction, after serving the time, having to find housing when the only legal means of discrimination against a person who has a conviction is in the housing sector, having to find employment when there are so many barriers against employment in itself is detrimental on a person's mental health. Having to reconnect with community and family, having to stay on the straight and narrow and not get violated or reoffend based on having probation terms that they need to meet. And then we have this opioid crisis, and then we have this huge housing crisis. There are so many things that people have to deal with externally that nothing that a reentry program inside of Department of Corrections can prepare them for. And that in itself, I believe, should warrant everybody having access to counseling, but that is not the reality, right? That is not feasible when we talk about a person not having an official diagnosis. So few people have the official diagnoses, and the ones who do have some limited access to counseling and medications and some form of isolation for their protection a lot of times.
Okay. And in prisons with people who do have a mental health diagnosis, are they usually kept on the same unit, or are they kind of dispersed with like general population? I'm just curious about that.
So it depends. It depends on the severity of their issues or their diagnoses. Most times they are dispersed amongst, others, and they operate just like everybody else. It's understood, and it is in their file or jacket that they have this diagnosis. But if it is a severe case, a lot of times they're kept close, in close quarters with others. But most people who have some sort of diagnosis, if it's not severe, they are among everybody else. And a lot of people don't want to admit that that is a thing. They don't want to admit that they need the services. They don't want to admit that they're receiving the services. I have a friend who I work very closely with who said one day that, I think everybody needs the help, but there's a stigma attached to it. So a lot of people avoid asking for the help because you're considered weak if you ask for the help, but they know they need it, right? So it
Yeah,
really
I was gonna
depends
ask
on that.
you, oh, sorry, I was gonna ask you next, like, you mentioned that having a mental health diagnosis, um, that prisoners will try to hide that, or individuals try to hide that because they make them more vulnerable. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, that vulnerability, like why having that mental health diagnosis would make a prisoner more vulnerable if other people
So
knew?
so a lot of times in Department of Corrections, if there is a mental health diagnosis in your file, you may lose privileges that people have, like having certain things in your cell. They want to make sure that you are not a danger to yourself and others. So you may lose access to, um, your commissary, your sheets. Sometimes, it really depends on how seriously they take the situation. So a lot of people don't want to do that. They don't want to expose themselves to others to think that they have some type of mental health diagnosis. So a lot of people hide it, or they just avoid the conversations about it. Nobody wants to be seen as the person who is weak, right? Um, and it is a shame that in this day and age in 2023 that is how it is, but it has been that way for a long time, even outside, even without being incarcerated, where you have access to more things. Not a lot of people will admit that they have a counselor or even a therapist. Like, I'm all for therapy. I think that everybody needs a therapist, or at least somebody who will be an accountability partner. But some people, especially men, unfortunately, don't want to be perceived as someone who can't handle their own problems or issues. And that a lot of times means that a mental health break will come out later in life, and everybody will say, I've never seen this. I've never heard about this. I never thought that this person would do this. It is because they hid it so well for so long that once the break finally happens, um, everybody's surprised a lot of times. So, a lot of people try to normalize pretending to be good. You hear a lot of people say, oh, how are you doing? And everybody, I'm okay, and nobody really gets to the gist of what really is going on and what really needs to be expressed. And it's no different inside of the facilities.
Mhm. Um, and one of the questions that we have is like, what is the impact on the mental health of youth that have parents or guardians that are incarcerated?
So we work with young people who have parents who are incarcerated, who have been suspended or expelled from school, or who have contact with Department of Juvenile Justice. Since COVID, especially since everything, school was virtual, everything was done on social media. A lot of young people, not even just young people who have parents who are incarcerated or who have these contacts, have heightened mental health diagnoses or issues. We are seeing it with the increase in gun violence. We're seeing it with the increase in like assaults and fights and different things like that, getting back to the so-called norm of post-COVID, which we are not in post-COVID. We thought we were, I guess, but we're seeing so many things from young people as a result of what happened during COVID, the isolation that happened during COVID, not having that familiar contact with friends and teachers and people that they were able to call on for help, or counselors and different things like that. But even more so with young people who were essentially separated from their parents or loved ones who are incarcerated, not being able to go in for face-to-face visits, not being able to do the video visits, sometimes not even getting a call as frequently as they were getting calls from loved ones. We see that that heightened anxiety about rebuilding the relationships with parents. We hear some young people say, what's going to happen when they come home? Because I haven't been able to talk to them for weeks on end now, and it's rebuilding all over again. So that was really something that stood out, like especially in the groups of young people that we were speaking to on a regular basis. And it just like anybody else, I think everybody wanted the adults to be okay and nobody to pay attention to the young people, right? And we're seeing the adverse effects of that now with all of the things that are happening. We see the football games saying you can't, as a young person, you have to have a chaperone now. And young people had to adjust to something in their adult world and learn really quickly different ways of survival and staying safe. And adding that on to a person who already is separated from their loved one who is incarcerated was really hard by all means for these young people. So still working through it, still trying to figure it all out. And I think young people were largely not forgotten about or ignored, but it's kind of not thought about. We always think about resilience with young people, but they were kind of like disregarded a little bit.
And what about, youth in like Department of Juvenile Justice? Is that anything you can speak on about how like mental health impacts them there, or, and what kind of services are offered in DJJ facilities for mental health?
That's hard. Like, it's hard. Before COVID, we were able to go into different facilities and, do programming, do mentoring, talking to young people. And when COVID happened, it was completely shut off. We haven't been back in DJJ facilities since, but in 2020, when I was working at United Methodist Family Service as a transport mentor, and what that is, they have a partnership with Department of Juvenile Justice. They also have foster children, and they have children, young people who are admitted by their parents, like voluntarily, for behavior issues or what have you. At Department of the young people who come from Department of Juvenile Justice at that facility receive wraparound services, receive counseling, receive mentors, receive programming, receive a ton of support. And when COVID happened, a lot of that was kind of cut off. Like a lot of people were not allowed to come on campus anymore. They still were in congregate living quarters, so they still had contact with others, like other youth and their counselors, because it's a 24-hour facility, but it was not the same as having all of these support services. But in the actual juvenile facility, the locked facilities, a lot of human contact was cut off during COVID.
Okay. And we do have a question in the chat from Nelson Diaz asked, what can someone do if they're worried about a loved one's mental health while they're incarcerated?
That's a very difficult question to ask, but mostly talking to that individual, talking to their counselor, reaching out. A lot of times there are barriers, there are HIPAA laws around actually getting answers and resolve. So you really have to have the conversations with the actual loved one. But counselors, depending on the facility, sometimes helps. Filing a grievance a lot of times with the inspector general. And I think that is a good segue into our budget bill just added $250,000 for an ombudsman's office, which means that there will be oversight of Department of Corrections. And that is something that we have been fighting for almost a decade. And it has been largely fought against by the powers that be in Department of Corrections. What they said this year was it was more bureaucratic red tape, and they did not need oversight for the $1.8 billion budget that they have and the thousands of lives that they're responsible for. Because of the series of deaths and overdoses in Department of Corrections recently. I think there was a fire at Greensville Correctional Center a couple of weeks, and a lot of overdoses. There was an agreement to add the oversight into the budget and start this actual office, which is necessary because it's not just for residents of Department of Corrections, it's also for staff to address their concerns. But the short answer is have candid conversations with your loved one. See if you can reach out to their counselors, file complaints if you have concerns that their mental health is not being addressed, file complaints with the warden, talk to the majors and the staff, talk to the counselors. People really have to advocate hard because, as is, people who are incarcerated are looked at as less than human. And a lot of times they are disregarded. So you have to fight a little bit harder for people who are incarcerated when you feel there is a concern.
Yeah, I find that family members, are always like the most important advocates, or, loved ones, friends, people who care are sometimes like they're the only way that that person's going to get help. Oftentimes is by, family members or loved ones that like just don't give up and stay on top of it. And we have another a good question from Sally Conway, and Sally has a comment. And Sally, if you want to, if anybody, you're welcome to come off of mute, or turn your camera off if you want to jump in. But otherwise, I'll go ahead and read it. Sally writes that prison has become our de facto mental health system. In community mental health services and or diversion programs can provide alternatives other than imprisonment. Can you talk a little bit about this?
So we have in Richmond, and I'm not sure how many other localities. I know that there are some. We have a mental health docket, and we also have a drug court docket. It's very difficult to get on that docket if you do not have a prior mental health diagnosis or substance use history, right? You have to take a plea of guilty a lot of times. If you may get diversion services, if you are accepted into the program. I think we go on Thursdays or something at 1 o'clock, and it's mostly when the court is less full. And the judge and all of the practitioners offer like resources and wraparound services, some group therapy, some different treatment, making sure that people are staying employed, making sure that they're having access to their meds, making sure that their insurance is kept up to date. So there are wraparound services provided for individuals who are accepted into these drug courts and these diversion programs and these mental health dockets. Not enough, and I know I keep saying not enough, but there are not enough. We don't have wraparound services for people who are in poverty, who end up going into that other end. Sometimes the trigger for mental health is incarceration. Sometimes the trigger is handcuffs, and that's unfortunate because everybody deserves wraparound services. We do have the Marcus Alert, which is a fairly new pilot program where people dial 988, and there should be social workers and like individuals in the community dispatched to help resolve a behavioral health issue. Policing would not be the first answer, but that is not always the case. If people are in danger, that that is not an option. Like police still have to respond a lot of times. So there have been few times where the actual counselors are able to resolve issues without criminal contact, but it has happened. And this is a fairly new thing. So there's not a lot of data on it. We did have a meeting with Department of Behavioral Health Services where they produced a report kind of showing the preliminary numbers. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot more work to do. But really I think, and this is my thing about providing the resources for people early on before they have contact with these prison or carceral systems is necessary. But we have a lot of people who say, not in my backyard, it doesn't concern me. If it hasn't impacted me, it's not important until it actually impacts you. Like we have seen Senator Creeves for years advocate for a more robust mental health system. And I think this governor has also pushed for more mental health services and things this year. So while that's great, we still have a lot more work to do. And the alternatives a lot of times are intense wraparound services for people who have diagnoses, not necessarily people who don't have diagnoses. So a lot of times you do see handcuffs as the answer instead of support, even if like in the moment we see it. A lot of times people don't survive contact with police. We've seen a lot of murders, and I know that that's a very sensitive thing, but a lot of times when police respond, it does not end well. We just saw a settlement from a young man who was killed in Central State as a result of a mental health issue. So the goal is to have more community-based services to provide wraparound services before they get into these systems. But the reality is a lot of people rely on policing to be the safety in the community, and that's not always the case, especially for people who have behavioral health issues.
That was a very thorough response. Thank you for going into all that. I had a question about earlier, you mentioned to go back to the mental health docket for a second. How do people access, like, how do they get on a mental health docket, and like how is that, different from other courts? What makes it different?
So in Richmond, we have a behavioral health docket, we have a substance use docket, which is drug court, and we have a veterans court docket. And very limited in who can get access to these things, but typically you have a behavioral health diagnosis, or you are willing to be assessed. A lot of times it starts at an arraignment where, the judge will request an assessment if it is believed that there is a mental health issue at play. That assessment starts, young person sees a practitioner, they write a final report, and then they're determine whether or not they are eligible for these services. Going into the mental health docket, there are teams of people who provide these services for an individual, and it is based on each individual's circumstances and their needs and the severity of the crime that they're accused of. A lot of times you will see less severe crimes that are eligible for these services. Typically, you won't see it for things like, homicide, class 1, 2, and 3, like the higher level felonies. But a lot of times, this is where it starts. A lot of times, these smaller crimes, shoplifting, sometimes assault on family member, things like that, is where it starts, like the contact with these systems. And it takes judges, it takes public defenders, it takes prosecutors working together to make sure that those people have services like therapists, counselors, behavioral health professionals, people who are in groups that require them to come to meetings where they have to complete different things like anger management, have to complete thinking for a change, different programs that keep them on track. And they have to check in. They have to commit to checking in and going to court more frequently than a regular case. The difference is, if you have a regular arrest and you go to court, typically you go to court one time, they decide whether you're paying fines, fees, restitution, and or other, if you're going to get jail time or community service or whatever the issue is. But with the mental health docket, it is an intensive process where a person is going to court more frequently and being assessed on a more regular basis and being given access to resources in the community who also partner with the court to make sure that they're on track. And a lot of times it ends in diversion. It ends in them not being actually charged or having that charge removed at the end of completion of whatever programs they have. But it really takes the team of people to come together to say this person should be on this mental health docket.
That reminded me that Virginia recently started allowing attorneys to bring submit evidence of mental health diagnoses, during court or in court, where that was never allowed before. And I don't think a lot of attorneys realize like that has changed. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And have you seen the impact of that yet, of, attorneys being allowed to submit that evidence? Any thoughts on that?
I won't say I've seen a big impact yet. This is a fairly new thing with
Yeah.
this year, this year's legislation. And like you said, not a lot of attorneys are aware, but it was a huge push. And I don't know if people in Virginia are familiar with the Matthew Russian case, where a young autistic boy in Virginia Beach got into a car accident, and there were injuries. No one died, but there were severe injuries. And because of his echolalia, which means that he repeats back things that people say to him, when the officer asked him, were you trying to kill himself? He repeated that and said, yes. He was bleeding. He had a laceration in his head. There's body cam footage. They did not give him treatment. They did not take him to a hospital. But that case, he ended up being sentenced to 50 years. And after some time, and I apologize, I don't know the exact amount of time that he spent incarcerated. He had some health issues while he was incarcerated, clear mental health issues, clear developmental delay issues. And it is very close to home because myself, I have a 22-year-old son who is autistic, who refuses to drive because of this situation. But advocates like myself and others went to court. Senator Boysko led a lot on getting the bill passed and making sure that this could be a condition of bail a lot of times, because we have the presumption of guilt a lot of times. We hear presumption of innocence, but you have a presumption of guilt whenever you are charged with a crime and you spend that time fighting for your innocence. It is not what it should be. So being able to include this information is huge. And it gives people a more fair assessment of whether or not a person is a threat to society and whether or not they should receive bond, whether or not they should be referred to some sort of service, whether or not they should be referred to these specific specialty courts that give them more resources necessary. But it's too early to tell just how it's gonna go because it is fairly new, like this year new. But I think that it is a good thing, and I think that it is necessary, and I think that it gives magistrates a better, clear picture of who's in front of them when they're coming for bond, and maybe even looking at like history and what they do, like whatever they are charged with, like what led to that. So data
Yeah,
and jury is out.
yeah, I definitely think that not allowing that, I want to say evidence, but the diagnoses contributes to that stigma of mental health. Like we don't want to talk, like we're not going to consider that, we're not going to look at that in this case, and just how that impacts just everything without seeing like the full picture. So I was very happy to see that was changed. And you saw that in the chat.
Someone asked if Mr. Russian's sentence was reduced. He was pardoned, I think last year or late in the year before that by Governor Northam, and he has been home and he's been thriving. He is back in college. He's working. He does music. I follow him on social media, and he's just adorable young man who made a mistake and deserved some resources and support. So yes, he's home.
Okay. Let me see here. So we mentioned the ombudsman position earlier, and I just want to kind of go back to that because I felt like that's something that's a big deal. That's another thing that just, has come up recently for the ombudsman position. How do you think that, I wanted to dive into that a little more, like how do you think that would change how like services that people receive in prison, or do you see that having an impact, I guess, on mental health or services?
The goal of the ombudsman and oversight for Department of Corrections was as a direct result of people dying inside of the facilities. People suffering from behavioral health issues not being addressed early on, not having anybody to talk to when there were complaints about not eating, not being fed, not getting rec time, not being able to come out of their cells for days on end. But in the more severe cases of abuse, cases of understaffing and overpopulating and different things like that. Having an independent body who addresses staff concerns and resident concerns was something that we pushed really hard for, because we got letters about horror stories about people being tortured, especially up in the Western facilities that we hear about, Red Onion and King Mountain and Wallens Ridge and, Pocahontas and all these different facilities where people are essentially being tortured. I don't know, if you all have seen the documentary called Injustice: Hidden Crisis Inside of Virginia's Prisons. I am in it, but ACLU, Virginia Interfaith, humanization project, a lot of our partners, sentencing project, advancement project, came together to highlight the need for oversight inside of the Department of Corrections because we get these letters, because we get these messages on JPay and these phone calls about people dying, people not coming home whole because they're not being given the treatment that they request. If a person takes the notion to say, hey, I have an issue and I need support with this, there are not people to go to who will take it seriously, who will follow through and make sure that they get this. And I cannot say that the ombudsman program will be perfect because we don't know. We don't know what it looks like yet. They literally just signed our budget a couple of weeks ago. But I think it's necessary. I think having somebody who provides independent oversight of a facility that has a $1.8 billion budget, billion with a B budget every year, and has been largely the largest employer in the state for decades, have no oversight and no explanation as to why people are coming back out not whole, why people are dying inside and not from natural causes, not from health issues, why people are having these health concerns that we're paying so much money for. We spend so much money on healthcare as people age, and like if people don't know, people age out of crime. You know, the brain development thing is one thing that we hear about a lot for young people who are under the age of 25, but we don't hear about the older population aging out of crime and the increase in the healthcare costs and that we spend on behavioral health and high blood pressure, high cholesterol, you know, all these different things. So we are hopeful that this position will open up the conversation about just having someone who will look through a lens that is neutral, because we've had so many issues and problems in Department of Corrections for so long.
Yeah, that was and I know you don't do too much work in jails, but that was, one of the issues in jails is that also, of course, like that lack of oversight and accountability. And there's the Board of Local and Regional Jails that kind of oversees them, but yeah, you are shaking your
So,
head.
so for people who don't know, the Board of Local and Regional Jails largely does not do investigations into the facility concerns. They're looking at like things like refrigerator temperatures and making sure that locks work and things like that. The removal of that oversight has long since been removed. It is each sheriff and each locality has the ability to determine how their jails are run. There are some sheriffs that are doing some amazing things. We work Chesterfield's jail. I had the honor of being honored alongside him this past Sunday and his heart program. He is doing amazing things and he is trying to make sure that people have what they need so that they don't come back to the facility. In Henrico, we work with Sheriff Gregory. They do amazing things to try, to make sure that individuals don't come back and make sure that they are getting what they need before they are released. Um, I'll be quiet on the other ones, but there's a lot of work to do. There is a lot of staffing issues. There are a lot of issues around because it's not just people who are refusing to do better. Sometimes they don't have the capacity to do better. Sometimes they don't have the resources to do better. But there are some sheriffs who are trying. But it is really there's no uniform way of making sure that each facility has these same guardrails in place, has these same resources and things like that. And that is at the detriment of the people who are inside of facilities, unfortunately.
And one last question is, I've heard from some DOC officials that talk about, the frustration that they have with receiving, like through transfers, receiving inmates from jails to DOC, and how they're not coming with they're not getting transferred with the full information and assessments and and I know that that's been some frustration for DOC to then try and figure out what is going on with this person, what are their needs. What are your thoughts on have you seen those kind of issues or in regards to the transfers?
So what a lot of people in order to go into Department of Corrections facility, you typically have to have 4 years or more. A lot of times, if you have less than 4 years, and it really depends on how severe your crime is, you are left in a jail and you are what is considered a state responsible inmate. What that means is Department of Corrections has a contact with whichever jail and they pay a per diem per day for that individual to stay inside that facility. They don't get the same type of programming, education. They don't get the same type of like work release. They don't get the same type of reentry support. They do stay close to home, but a lot of times that means they're kind of sort of in limbo. When an individual is going through court, which is the period that we call pretrial, before they have actually been convicted of a crime. Sometimes they are having to go to court in different localities. Sometimes they are coming, from facilities where they're waiting for hearings, and they, especially during COVID, hearings were put off for years sometimes. So they're sitting in jails a lot of times if they don't get bail, if they don't make cash bail. And when it's time to be transferred out to DOC, they have not been invested in the same way as others who are less temporary there. So DOC is starting from scratch a lot of times with people. If they did not have mental health diagnosis prior to being arrested, a lot of times it is going to be the responsibility of Department of Corrections to make that assessment, get that diagnosis, if at all, because we have to understand that there are a lot of people who will never get that diagnosis, especially if it comes with carceral contact, especially if it comes with a charge. A lot of times, once you get arrested and you go to court, they're not going to look back and say there's a behavioral health component to this, right? They're looking completely at a punitive means. And that is how people slip through the cracks a lot of times. Not doing the assessment because of the severity of the crime a lot of times is something that we see a lot, but the transfer really is starting the process over,
Well, I think we're almost out of time, but I want to thank you for your very in-depth responses to all those questions. I want to take a moment to see if anybody else has any questions, any comments from anyone. You're welcome to come off mute if you want to ask anything. I guess that means we just went through everything.
Y'all look quiet, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sheba, for joining our summit session and providing like very in-depth information about mental health and how it impacts not just like current inmates, but just the whole system and the ripple effect that that has in the community. And that's you guys are doing good work, and
thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, very.
Take care.
All right.